Welcome, scholars, to this final review of the Q3 free response question. First of all, a little note on what the task is. The Q3 asks you to develop a position in response to a given topic. The topic may ask you to take a position on some specific issue, or it may simply give you a general concept to consider. Either way, you must craft an argument. This is an argument-driven paper. You just kind of have to roll with whatever prompt you're given. Responding to the task, effective Q3 responses will take a complex, thoughtful position on the topic. They will develop that position deliberately, progressing through a series of well-considered arguments before finally arriving at a conclusion. Effective responses will also feature sound reasoning, including qualified claims, that is, claims that are limited or the limitations of which are explained in some way, clear premises, well-supported generalizations, concessions, and refutations. Effective responses will also illustrate their reasoning with multiple short, simple examples which are designed to support some generalization the student's trying to make. Finally, effective responses will reference the thoughts of great thinkers and the works of the literary canon to help illustrate or support its ideas. Ineffective responses will often take an overly general, narrow, or simplistic position on the topic, treating the issue as a black or white or yes or no proposition. Ineffective responses will also generally use an unsophisticated or formulaic organizational structure. In other words, assigning body paragraphs strictly to examine different reasons why the thesis is valid, writing a conclusion which does little but repeat what has already been said. Those essay writing techniques that students are taught in 8th grade, we're looking for something more advanced at the AP Lang level. Ineffective responses will also often rely on lengthily narrated examples to support ideas with little or no explicit logical defense. These essays are going to have just perhaps one giant example per paragraph with very little actual logical premises or logical commentary, that sort of thing. Ineffective responses may also include attempts at concession, but oftentimes these attempts at concession concede little or nothing. Similarly, ineffective responses may include attempts at refuting some counter-argument, but with a counter-argument that is contrived or unreasonable, bordering on committing a straw man fallacy. We'll often see students try to counter some common argument. It has been said that, and then what they follow that with is something completely bogus that no one has ever said. And so that makes it a really ineffective response because the counter argument is invented from nothing. Finally, ineffective responses will often reference pop culture, including movies, television shows, and young adult novels. Some things to avoid on the Q3, specifically, don't force yourself into, quote, taking a side. Not all prompts will ask you to consider topics that even have sides, so don't force them to have sides. Don't create sides for them. You can simply explore what one particular aspect of the topic, and arrive at some conclusion about that. You don't have to somehow divide it in half like people are arguing over it. Unless the prompt says otherwise, you also shouldn't force yourself to declare that something should or should not be done. Don't force yourself to make that prescriptive call to action unless the prompt specifically says, develop a position on whether or not this should be done. I go back over and over again to the polite speech prompt, which I graded a couple of years back. The prompt just said simply develop a position on the use of polite speech. And so many students forced that into a taking a side type of prompt. 90% of the essays I graded were, yes, polite speech is good, or no, polite speech is not good, when there's so many interesting aspects of polite speech in everyday life that were completely ignored because students were trying to turn this into some sort of debate when it wasn't a debate. It was just a topic to consider. Next up, try to avoid those formulaic multi-part theses. You know what I'm talking about. X is Y because of reason A, reason B, and reason C. Avoid that. Don't use that. Those types of thesis statements force your essay to take that highly formulaic path, and we don't want to see formulaic, predictable organizational patterns. Honestly, that because of A, B, and C, you're putting yourself in a corner. You're forcing yourself to argue three separate points to justify whatever your main claim is, your main conclusion. In 40 minutes, you can't actually argue three separate reasons with enough sophistication. There's just not enough time. Next up, don't use lengthy examples. Pick examples instead that are simple to understand or are widely known. If you ever at any point find yourself relating the plot of a book or a movie, stop. Quit narrating to me. You need to pick a simpler example. If you ever find yourself narrating, say, the events leading up to the American Revolution, stop. You need to pick a historical example that is more widely known, or just acknowledge that your reader, who are all college-educated people, we know about the American Revolution. So this wastes a whole lot of time. These lengthy examples waste a ton of time, and they actually distract from the focus of your essay. And we see this every year. An essay about, let's go back to polite speech, an essay that's about polite speech, but a whole paragraph is written about the Civil War or something like that. That really distracts from the focus. And honestly, the point the student's trying to make is rarely very good after all that narration. Next up, don't reference pop culture or young adult novels to lend your argument support. These sorts of things can be perfectly fine to reference as illustrations of modern culture. For instance, if you read a lot of young adult novels and you're trying to make a point about how kids today rarely read the classics, sure, supply a list of young adult novels, that sort of thing. Or if you're trying to argue that society today is obsessed with dystopian fiction, sure, you might talk about how young people are reading these novels that have all these kind of dystopian futures. However, the themes and messages of young adult novels lend virtually no credibility to weighty ideas. Okay, novels are illustrations of the human condition, but young adult novels are kind of a light version of that, and they don't lend much weight to your arguments. So just think very carefully about your audience. The essay graders are a bunch of teachers and college professors who have not read these books and who have spent their entire careers trying to get students to not just read these books, but read the classics as well because of the value of the classics. And so if all you reference is Hunger Games and Divergent and all that, you're going to just rile up your reader, and they're not going to be very favorable to your score. Another thing to avoid, don't reference personal anecdotes to lend your argument support. Again, personal anecdotes shouldn't be banned completely, but they can be perfectly fine to, say, relate when you're trying to illustrate some concept. This one time I did this. That can be fine to kind of illustrate a concept, but your life experiences don't prove some larger truth about humanity, because you are just one person and your experiences are unique to you. Think again about the audience, but also think about who the speaker is. You are the speaker in this essay. Your audience have many, many years more experience than you do. And when you assume that your life experiences prove some larger truth about the world, that's kind of laughable to people who have spent so much longer in the world than you. So make sure that you approach any anecdotes with a certain acknowledgement of humility, or just use them in spot situations where you're just trying to illustrate something and not trying to prove something. All right, some Q3 keys to success. First of all, try to treat this essay as a way to showcase your logical deliberation on a topic. Your essay should resemble your logical flow of ideas as you move from considering point A to defining what you really mean by point B to testing point C against prevailing wisdom and so on. Your essay should almost read like you are on the page, turning ideas over in your mind, grappling with them, testing them here, testing them there, before finally arriving at a conclusion. This, believe it or not, was actually the original style that essays were written in before academic institutions got hold of the essay genre. And honestly, on the free response question, this is how what it should resemble. It's just sort of a kind of a deliberate turning over of ideas until you arrive at a conclusion. Next up, use an organizational structure which simulates this deliberative line of thinking. Remember, the most sophisticated arguments, when we map them out using our argument mapping techniques, they're going to be more vertical than horizontal. Okay? Your discussion should have layers, and it should dig through the layers and work its way from point A to point B, which leads to point C, which leads to point D, and so on and so forth. And your conclusion, of course, should be the climax. It should actually conclude something rather than just rehash the points you've already made. Next up, use your examples purposefully. Examples are designed to strengthen generalizations. Generalizations are strongest the more examples there are, so use multiple quick and simple examples rather than singular long examples. For instance, this is a much better way to provide examples than something long and narrated. We can see this sacrifice made time and time again: the Sedition Act, McCarthyism and the Red Scare, the Patriot Act. The list of ways the American people have shown a willingness to surrender freedom for security is long and predictable. Note I've just given a series of historical things there, and I'm relying on my reader to know what those are, as you should rely on your reader to know. You'd never want to, say, we can see this sacrifice made time and time again. For instance, back in 1918, when blah, 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 the Espionage Act, you don't want to sit there and give me a whole freaking history paper just to tell me about the Sedition Act. Just mention it as an example and move on to another example, because multiple examples work to support generalizations far better than one long one. Next up, when you're referencing novels for support, understand what novels are. Novels and fiction are stories which illustrate the human experience. They can be referenced effectively when you're trying to support an idea about humanity or about society, but just like other examples, a single story cannot lend much support by itself. It must be used in tandem with other examples from literature or other examples from history or other hypothetical examples or whatever, or used to illustrate some logical argument that you've already made through premises. Finally, reference the ideas of the great authors that we've studied to help establish concepts. The ideas of Thoreau, Plato, Marx, or Kennedy can be referenced in a variety of ways to lend concurrence to an argument you are making, to voice some prevailing school of thought, or to elaborate or explain some ideas that you are trying to argue. If you did your assigned reading this year, you should be full of great ideas from great thinkers. So why not throw those in? All right, that is all I have for this final review of the Q3 free response question. Good luck in your studies, and I'll see you in class.